Okay. First, you've got to understand, and this sounds obvious, of course, but grief is always associated with loss of some kind. That's what grief has to do with, loss. Most of the time, we associate it with the loss of a close member of the family or the loss of a close friend. But people can grieve for any kind of loss, anything that affects them emotionally. So people can grieve for the loss of a famous person that they've never met. We've seen this recently with Steve Jobs, and we've seen this recently with Michael Jackson. The grieving for Elvis is still going on. And yet, there are other famous people who have died who don't get that same kind of widespread grieving process. Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, a lot of male movie stars recently. But when a person identifies with someone, like I say, they don't have to know them, but when they have a personal identification or they feel great emotional attachment to something they do, like there's actually a term for Macintosh people who, they're called Mac addicts. When there's a strong emotional attachment to something related to the person, the music or whatever it might be, then there's a true grieving. But why? What's really going on here? Before we say that, we'll have to also mention that people can grieve over the loss of a fortune, over the loss of a home or a job, or even the loss of a way of life. Let's look at the psychology of grief, because this is going to tell us where it comes from in the first place. The psychology of grief has to do with mental resistance to some significant change. Because that's what loss really is. Loss is a change. Now, resistance to change is natural. Okay? It's part of our life, it's part of our health, actually. But the pain and emotional symptoms that accompany the loss aren't necessary. The more significant the change is to us, the more it causes changes in our patterns of thinking and feeling and acting, the greater the resistance to that loss. And a great loss causes great disruptions in our patterns, and therefore it causes great resistance. Now what happens is these symptoms that I talk about that can occur with it are directly related to the mental resistance, because mental resistance to something produces physical resistance in the body. And physical resistance, when it's strong enough, can cause all kinds of physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, and then it circles around and causes mental symptoms again. It's been my experience, well, let's put it this way first. The intensity of grief and the duration of grief, how long it lasts, is entirely dependent on how we think about the loss and how often we keep remembering and resisting the consequences of that loss. In other words, the effect it had on changing our patterns. It's been my experience in working with a lot of people in the grief process that intense and prolonged grief almost always has a strong aspect of anger that goes along with it. It can be anger at the person who's gone. It can be anger at someone involved in the loss. It can be anger at the fact that something is no longer part of our life. But the thing that keeps it going for so long, there's always some component of anger, and sometimes that's the biggest part. In relation to grief, we often hear the phrase, time heals all wounds. Well, that means that as memories fade in intensity and new patterns emerge to replace or compensate for the old ones, there tends to be less and less resistance to what happens. That's why, as a tradition in many places in the world, the person goes into mourning for a year. or more. And this kind of healing, just letting time pass, works for many, many people. Okay? That's why it keeps being done. But actual grieving time can be greatly relieved or shortened. I mean the hurtful part of it, okay? To the degree that we can accept the loss as a fact of life. This is what keeps a lot of people going with it, because they don't or they won't. But to the degree that we can accept it as a fact of life, however unpleasant, it can be greatly prolonged by continually thinking that the loss shouldn't have happened, even though it did. And that shouldn't, but it did, but it shouldn't have, but it did, but it shouldn't have, keeps a tremendous amount of tension, which is a form of anger at the fact that it did. Okay? Grieving time can also be shortened by remembering the good things about what is no longer there, whether it's a person or situation or something else. And of course, it can be lengthened by dwelling on the bad effects of the absence. Right? That comes down to personal habit and choice. But if you can consciously bring the good things to focus and take pleasure in those good things, it lessens all the pain of it. When anger is involved, some process of forgiveness is really, really helpful. It'll help the healing. In the story just told, okay, grieving can be healed or relieved when we become motivated or involved in a solution to the loss or in a new project that compensates for it. It's also possible, just want to tell you it's possible, to heal the physical reactions and the symptoms and the mental reactions of grief and loss by changing the state of our mind and changing the state of our body with certain kinds of techniques that bring us into the present moment and make the change. One of them is one we teach called Dynamind. There's one called an emotional freedom technique. There's a number of these different kinds of techniques that help change mind and body in the present moment and have remarkably good results. The important thing to remember in all of this that we're talking about is that grief is not a bad thing, okay? It's natural to have it. It's natural to feel it from time to time when our thoughts bring up memories of someone or something that's no longer there. But it doesn't have to be painful. It doesn't have to keep us from being happy most of the time or whenever we can.